The Laffer curve is named after economist Art Laffer, but it was first conceived by a 14th century Islamic scholar. Now suppose the income tax rate is 0%. If the income tax rate is 0%, government is not going to collect any revenue because the tax rate is 0%. Applying that point on the graph, we place a big red dot on the point 0, 0. Now, people will not work and firms will not produce anything if the tax rate is 100%. I mean, if you make $100,000 by working 40 hours a week and the government says, I'm going to take all of your income, so you have nothing at the end of the year, or nothing at every paycheck, you'll choose not to work. And if you choose not to work, nothing will be produced. And so if no one works and nothing's produced, the company generates no income. Hence, tax revenue is 0 when the tax rate is 100%. Now, if tax revenue is 0 when the tax rate is 0% or 100%, there's a tax rate where the tax revenue reaches a maximum value. In this diagram, the optimal tax rate is 30%. Hence, according to the Laffer curve, according to this Laffer curve, maybe the ideal thing to do is to just set the tax rate at 30% and leave it. Now this tax rate would generate, according to this diagram, $2.5 trillion in tax revenue. Okay. Now the tax rate is 60%. We're going to generate $1.7 trillion. Suppose it's at 60%, we're going to generate $1.7 trillion. If the tax rate is cut at 30%, revenues increase to 2.5. So a tax rate cut in this model raises tax revenue by nearly $1 trillion. Now if the tax rate is 30%, the tax revenue again is 2.5 trillion. If the tax rate is raised to 60% because a politician says we need to raise the tax rate to raise revenue, what's going to end up happening is revenues fall to 1.7 trillion. So a tax rate increase in this model results in a loss of nearly $1 trillion in government revenue. Now, the Laffer curve also suggests that when tax rates are low, a tax cut lowers tax revenue. For example, if the rate is 30%, again, tax revenue is 2.5 trillion. If the rate is cut to 10%, tax revenue drops to 1.6 trillion. This is the U.S. Laffer curve that I derived using Federal Reserve data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve's database called the FRED. And what I have on the y-axis are tax revenues as a percent of GDP, T divided by Y. On the x-axis, I have the United States historical top marginal tax rates. During the early part of the 20th century, the top marginal tax rate was around 91%. What this black curve represents is the Laffer curve. And the equation for the black curve is this red equation up here. And the graph of that curve is the black curve. And according to this black curve, the optimal tax rate appears to be about 35%. Another approach to conducting fiscal policy is to focus on marginal tax rates. And people that do that are called supply-siders. Changes in marginal tax rates may exert an impact on aggregate supply because the changes will influence the relative attractiveness of productive activity in comparison to leisure and tax avoidance. The impact of supply-side effects usually take place over a lengthy period of time. Supply-siders are more concerned about long-run growth. Keynesians are more worried about closing inflationary or recessionary gaps with fiscal policy, tax cuts, increased government spending, yada yada yada. There is some evidence that countries with high taxes grow more slowly, for example France and Germany versus the United Kingdom and the United States. There is evidence they are important for taxpayers facing extremely high tax rates, say rates of 40% or above. In the model below, the economy is at E0. Now, if the economy is hamstrung by regulation, red tape, high marginal tax rates, generous safety nets like welfare payments and unemployment benefits, food stamps, then the economic growth of the economy is going to be near zero. So over the long run, real GDP stays at Y0. There really is no growth. And you can see that over a 20-year period in many of the nations of Europe. Now, in a environment of strong property rights, little bureaucratic red tape coming from DC, lowering marginal tax rates increase the incentive to earn and use resources efficiently. Supply-siders believe that aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply, or full employment output, all increase horizontally together. So over time, lower marginal tax rates promote more rapid growth. So instead of the GDP staying near Y0, real GDP grows from Y0 to Y1. The figure below shows percent of federal income tax paid by the top 50% of earners in America, the top 25%, the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1%, and the ultra super rich, the top 0.1%. The blue bars represent periods of economic recession. 1986, the top rate was cut from 50% to 30%. In 1990 to 1993, the top rate was raised from 30 to 39, and this cost President Bush, the first President Bush, re-election in 1982, because he had promised in 1988, no new taxes. Read my lips. In 1997, President Clinton agreed to cut capital gains tax rate. In 2003, Bush and the Republicans in Congress lowered all marginal tax rates. If you look at the black line, in 1987, the top 50% of earners paid about 95% of federal income taxes. By 2008, they were paying about 97%, which meant the bottom 50%, their burden shrunk from 5% down to about 3%. Now the red line tells a similar story. The top 25% of wage earners paid roughly about 80% in 1987, but by 2008 they were paying about, looks like about 87% of all federal income taxes. Now what's really interesting is that when you get to the top 10% of wage earners in America, the top 5%, the top 1%, and the ultra rich, the top 0.1%, you see the burdens they're bearing are fluctuating with the economy. After the recession ends, their burden increases. Just before the start of a recession, their burden starts declining. And what's really interesting is that in 2003, when the Republicans had their marginal tax rate cuts in play, burden of federal income taxes grow substantially. The ultra-rich, the top 0.1%, paid about 18% of all federal income taxes. By 2007, they were paying 20% of all federal income taxes. And we're talking about the top 0.1% paying 20% of all federal income taxes. The top 10%, this is pretty remarkable in my opinion, the top 10% of wage earners in 2003, when the Bush tax cuts took effect, were paying what looks like about 65% of all federal income taxes. By 2007, they're paying over 70% of all federal income taxes. So the question is here, do supply-siders soak the rich with lower tax rates? That's kind of interesting. Now, during the 1960s and 70s, budget deficits were generally small, except during recessions. Budget deficits generally increased during recessions and shrank during expansions, primarily as a result of automatic stabilizers like unemployment benefits, progressive tax rates, and corporate tax rates, rather than discretionary fiscal policy. Reductions in income tax rates and sharp increases in defense expenditures led to large deficits during the 1980s. While increases in defense spending expand the deficit in the 1980s, the opposite was true during the 1990s. The deficit shrank during the 1990s, and by the end of the decade, federal budget surpluses were present. The combination of the 2001 recession and the economy's sluggish recovery, the Bush administration's tax cut, the increases in defense spending, quickly moved budgets from surplus to deficit. In 2001, the Bush tax cuts we're talking about were the $300 checks mailed to individuals and the $600 checks mailed to couples. In the final year of the Bush administration, TARP bailouts and tax rebate checks pushed the deficit near $1 trillion. The Obama administration, a couple months after taking office, announced Americans should get used to trillion-dollar deficits for the next 10 years. In the chart below, we have expenditures as a percent of GDP and tax revenues as a percent of GDP. In the late 1950s, early 60s, we have surpluses. We have surpluses for a short time near the beginning of the 1970s. We have surpluses for a short time between 1997 and the year 2000. Most of the time, our government runs large deficits. The deficits were quite large during the 1980s as a percent of GDP. Now the question is, how large are they going to be in the future? This is an interesting diagram here. I have scatter plotted economic growth on the x-axis versus growth in tax revenues. Now, if growth is 1%, taxes are only going to grow by about 1%. At 2% economic growth, we're going to have about 3% tax revenue growth. So a 1 percentage point increase in the economic growth rate raises the growth in tax revenues by nearly twice that, 1.9 percentage points. So I think the moral of this story is that pro-growth, pro-free market policies are good for the economy and good for raising revenue. Even though the federal deficits were large in the 1980s and small during the 1990s, real economic growth was strong and the inflation rate low during both decades. This result is consistent with the view that fiscal policy exerts only a modest impact on aggregate demand, much like the crowding out and new classical models imply.